In a nationally televised showdown watched by over 12 million Americans, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett confronts conservative figure Charlie Kirk over shocking allegations of scholarship fraud and political data harvesting. Kirk strikes first, mocking her, unleashing a deepfake video, and calling her trash in front of a live audience. But Jasmine doesn't flinch. She pulls out 327 pages of proof, exposes a hidden whistleblower, and flips the entire narrative on its head. The fallout spreads fast. Sponsors pull out, campuses erupt, and public opinion shifts overnight. So what did Jasmine Crockett say that turned humiliation into power and changed everything? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The lights dimmed like the hush before a storm. The stage wasn't just a set, it was a line drawn in granite. Two podiums stood beneath twin spotlights, facing an audience deliberately split in two. On the left, Kirk's side, rows of clean-cut suits, starched flags on lapels, hands clasped in practiced confidence. On the right, Crockett's side, young, diverse faces, eyes burning not with fury, but with weary expectation. The seating wasn't random, it was a design. Every camera angle, every inch of the floor was mapped to capture confrontation. This wasn't a debate, it was a broadcast war, a moral prize fight wrapped in lights and ratings. From backstage, Jasmine Crockett emerged like a quiet storm. No entourage, no fanfare. Just the steel walk of someone who stood alone in halls that weren't built for her voice. Across from her, Charlie Kirk strode in with the swagger of someone who'd never known silence. He grinned like the cameras were old friends, like the crowd was his courtroom. Nicknamed the Logic Sword by his supporters, Kirk adjusted his mic with the ease of a man used to winning arguments before they started. Crockett didn't blink. She didn't smile. Her presence wasn't loud, but it shifted the air. She wasn't there to perform. She was there to fight. The host stepped forward, center stage, like a referee entering the ring. He didn't waste words. "This is not a panel," he said. "It's a reckoning." The crowd stirred. "There will be no edits, no filters. We will not censor opinions, but we will listen." The words dropped like weights into the room. A second passed, then another. The silence didn't just settle, it pressed. On the left, Kirk crossed his arms, nodding with amusement. On the right, Crockett simply stood, unmoving, measured, the kind of stillness that only comes before something explodes. And somewhere off camera, a producer whispered, "We're live." The silence after the moderator's final sentence stretched, not awkward, but charged, like the room knew something was coming but didn't know from where or how hard it would hit. Jasmine Crockett adjusted the microphone with a calmness that wasn't rehearsed. It was earned. Earned in late-night committee rooms no camera ever aired. Earned while being interrupted, talked over, disrespected, and still not leaving her seat. She began quietly. "What we're living through isn't just political division. It's moral distortion. It's the theater of outrage replacing the work of justice." She let that hang. "We're told who the villains are by billionaires who own the stage. We're told who's dangerous by people who've never had to choose between insulin and groceries. And we're told who to trust by the ones writing checks behind the curtain." Her voice didn't rise, it deepened. "There are voices, loud, proud, polished voices, who brand themselves as truth-tellers, who rally against corruption while drinking from its fountain, who condemn the elite while flying private to sit with them." She didn't glance at Charlie Kirk. She didn't need to. "They say justice is a lie, but only because justice, real justice, would threaten the empire they've built on fear and clickbait." Her eyes swept the room, not confrontational, but steady. "Director. They wear crosses on their lapels while mocking the hungry. They quote Martin Luther King while voting against school lunches. And every time we call it out, they say we're being divisive. But if truth divides us, then maybe the lie was what held us together." A murmur flickered across the crowd, uncomfortable, uncertain. Charlie Kirk shifted slightly in his seat. The cameras caught it. Crockett didn't flinch. "I know what it's like to be told I'm too angry, too direct, too emotional," she continued. But what emotion do you expect from someone watching their community poisoned by policy and then blamed for the mess? What tone would you prefer when I'm describing a machine designed to erase me politely? Now she paused, not for effect, but for breath, a real one. This country doesn't lack resources. It lacks honesty. It lacks the courage to admit that those who scream the loudest about freedom often mean freedom for themselves and silence for everyone else. Still no names, still no finger pointed. But Charlie Kirk was no longer smiling. His posture had changed, subtle but visible, defensive. The air had shifted. Crockett hadn't just challenged an opponent. She had unmasked a system, and she wasn't done. Not even close. There was a stillness in the room, not the calm kind, but the charged silence just before lightning cracks opened the sky. Jasmine Crockett had just peeled back the curtain, exposing not just a man, but a system built on spectacle. The audience hadn't clapped, hadn't cheered. They were processing. And in that vulnerable moment, in that delicate pause where truth lingered like smoke, Charlie Kirk leaned forward, tapped the base of his microphone, and spoke. "It's cute that you showed up, Jasmine." The words oozed across the sound system with a polished smugness, dressed as charm but sharpened to cut. He smiled, not broadly, but with the tight, practiced curl of someone who had spent years turning dismissal into applause. "Let's be honest. You're not here to debate. You're here to perform." The crowd shifted, some with anticipation, others with dread. You wrap yourself in justice, but you peddle division. You say equity, but what you mean is entitlement. You march under banners of progress, but all you do is upload theatrics and call it legislation. He turned slightly to the audience, gesturing for effect. "You've turned Congress into TikTok, and worse, you've made anger your brand." Gasps, light and uncertain, rippled through the crowd like wind-stirring leaves. But Kirk wasn't done. He adjusted his cufflinks as if the next words needed an accessory. "You talk about corruption and conscience, but you don't even believe in the institutions you sit in. You demand respect but treat the Constitution like a doormat." His voice rose slightly, just enough to weaponize. "People like her." He paused, a beat too long. His eyes locked on Crockett, and the smile vanished. "Are trash." The air collapsed. The room didn't erupt. It detonated. Shouts burst from both sides of the hall. Chairs scraped. A woman near the front row stood up, pointed at Kirk, and shouted something unintelligible before being pulled back by security. The moderator fumbled with his earpiece, clearly receiving instructions and warnings at once, as producers scrambled behind the cameras. Let's bring this back," he said, his voice shaking but firm, like a man trying to glue glass mid-fall. "Everyone, let's bring this back to policy, please. Mr. Kirk," but it was already out. A word doesn't vanish once spoken on live air. It lingers. It stains. And yet Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't blink, didn't reach for her mic, didn't cast a glance toward the crowd for validation. She looked at him, only him, and held that gaze like steel pressed against soft flesh. Her face was unreadable, not passive, not polite, just still. The kind of stillness that says, "I have been here before." The kind that comes not from shock but from calculation. Because this was not the first time a man with power had tried to dehumanize her. It wouldn't be the last. And he had no idea how many years it took to not react. To carry that insult, that centuries-old insult, and not throw it back, but turn it into leverage. Around them, the noise pulsed, audience members shouting over each other, cell phones raised, tweets already flying across timelines. But in the eye of that storm stood Crockett, unmoved. Kirk, on the other hand, was shifting, barely perceptible, but enough for the cameras to catch. The aftertaste of his own words had settled in. His smirk was still there, but his eyes, they flickered. Not with regret, but with recognition. He realized, perhaps too late, that she hadn't broken. He had. The moderator tried again, voice louder now, almost pleading, "We will move forward. I'm asking everyone on stage to maintain respect." Kirk leaned back slightly, arms crossed, breathing through his nose like a man daring someone to challenge him. But no one looked at him now. All eyes were on Crockett. And still, She said nothing. Because silence, in moments like this, is not surrender. It's strategy. It's fuel. It's the weight of generations behind a single heartbeat. A man had just called a sitting congresswoman trash on national television, and the world was watching not what she would say, but what she would become. But she gave them nothing. Yet, only the quiet that makes a reckoning feel close. And Kirk, he just turned the floor into quicksand and didn't yet realize he was the one sinking. The moderator cleared his throat again, this time more carefully, like a man who had just witnessed a high-voltage wire snap and wasn't sure which way the sparks would jump. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said cautiously, offering her the floor. There was no applause, no chance, just a room balancing between scandal and spectacle. Jasmine leaned toward her mic with the kind of stillness that now had the weight of legend. Her voice was low, but razor sharp. "The word trash," she said, pausing just long enough to let the silence inhale, "belongs to the bag you've been stuffing under the American flag." Gasps whispered across the room like dry leaves in wind. No shouting now, just a shift in gravity. The metaphor didn't need decoding. It punched through fabric and bone. Kirk blinked once, twice, his smirk hollowing into a twitch. Jasmine didn't look at him again. She didn't need to. The room had pivoted. The power had shifted, and she wasn't about to waste it. She straightened a stack of papers on the podium, not for effect, but with the practiced movement of someone who knew what she was about to say had receipts. "Let's talk about integrity," she began, her tone composed but climbing. "And let's talk about a scholarship fund that claims to uplift the next generation of conservative leaders." She held up a printed pamphlet, the kind mailed to thousands of students across the country. On it was Charlie Kirk's face, beaming beside the slogan, "America's promise begins with you." "What they don't mention in the brochure," she continued, "is that less than 11% of those donations ever reached an actual student." Heads turned, phones went up. Jasmine continued, "Because the rest, it's been funneled through 5 separate LLCs, each barely traceable, each registered to P.O. boxes tied to the same 3 names. Not students, not educators, political consultants, media advisors. One of whom, by the way, happens to be the current treasurer for Mr. Kirk's personal PAC. She didn't raise her voice. The facts did the shouting for her. The camera cut to Kirk. He was motionless, eyes locked forward, jaw clenched. But his fingers tapped a restless rhythm against the edge of his podium. Jasmine was just getting started. "They told donors they were investing in education," she said. "What they funded was propaganda, wrapped in campus events, speaker tours, and branded merchandise sold at triple markup to the very kids they promised to help." She pulled up a slide on the monitor behind her, a web of transactions linking the scholarship fund to shell entities that circled back to a marketing firm in Scottsdale. This isn't oversight, it's orchestration. And while Charlie was touring campuses, handing out check-sized posters, the real money was laundering credibility. Gasps now turned into murmurs. Some in the Kirkside audience looked visibly uncomfortable, whispering, shifting in their seats. On the Crockett side, no one moved. They were still as stone. "Here's the cruelest part," Jasmine added, her tone softening but not weakening. "Students who applied, hundreds of them, received rejection emails citing limited funds, while that same year the foundation spent over $700,000 on branding optimization and executive retreats." She lifted a document. "One of those retreats was at a golf resort in the Caribbean. 4 nights, full bar, paid by checks labeled as Mentorship Program Evaluation. I have the receipts, and I'm submitting them to the Senate Committee on Charitable Abuse this week." The silence in the room was no longer neutral. It was tilting, tipping into something darker. Anger, the kind that simmers under disbelief, the kind that starts movements. "Charlie Kirk has called people like me trash," she said, now looking directly into the camera. "But I've never stolen opportunity from a struggling student and called it patriotism. I've never sold inspiration on a postcard and delivered silence to inboxes. I've never stood on a stage like this, holding the Bible in one hand and a marketing report in the other, hoping no one looks too close." The moderator didn't interrupt. He looked as stunned as the rest of the room. A low murmur rose from the back of the hall, no longer hostile or performative. It was inquiry. People turning to each other and asking, "Did you know about this? Is this real?" And Jasmine ended it not with a flourish, but with something colder. "There is nothing more dangerous," she said, "than a man who teaches young people that dishonesty is leadership and that slogans are substitutes for ethics." Then she stepped back. Charlie Kirk hadn't moved. His mic was live, but his lips were sealed. Whatever comeback he had prepared evaporated in the weight of paper, ink, and the piercing quiet of being exposed. A producer in the control booth whispered, "Oh my God." A floor manager mouthed to a cameraman, "Hold on her." Because Jasmine Crockett had done what no shouting match ever could. She turned his insult into a mirror and made him watch. The silence after Jasmine stepped back was brief. 10 seconds, maybe less. But it vibrated with aftershock. The room had just heard numbers, names, a chain of shell companies, and a luxury golf resort masquerading as a mentorship retreat. People weren't just watching anymore. They were reevaluating. And Jasmine, sensing the tremor beneath the surface, stepped forward again. Not to capitalize, but to finish what she'd started. "I said earlier that this wasn't about oversight," she said evenly. "It's about design. And the design goes deeper than money." She held up another file, a different kind this time. Thinner, marked with a yellow evidence tab. "We looked closer at the internal systems of the scholarship programs Mr. Kirk champions. The data trails told a darker story. A network of student information harvesting disguised as opportunity." The audience leaned in, quiet, alert, uneasy. Thousands of applicants, essay submissions, personal backgrounds, political leanings, religious views, all of it collected under the pretense of awarding funding. But less than 1 in 10 students ever saw a dollar. The rest? Their data was segmented, profiled, and routed to third-party targeting platforms for political ad campaigns. Conservative campaigns. She placed the file on the podium, one hand resting lightly atop it. This wasn't philanthropy, it was surveillance. A ripple moved across the audience, sharp as static. Kirk shifted, noticeable now. He adjusted his mic even though it didn't need adjusting. His mouth opened slightly, closed, then opened again. "That's not accurate," he muttered, just loud enough for the mic to catch it. Jasmine didn't acknowledge him. She turned to the moderator, who looked as stunned as anyone else. "I'd like to invite someone to speak," she said. "He was once a recipient of this scholarship. He believed in the promise, and then he worked behind the curtain." The stage lights dimmed slightly as a young man approached from the audience. A thin, nervous figure in a wrinkled blazer and jeans. He stepped up to the second microphone, cleared his throat once, and began. "My name is Eric Whitmore. I was awarded the Foundation of American Values Scholarship in 2022. I was also hired 6 months later as a junior program assistant at the same organization." His voice was calm, but his hands gripped the edges of the mic stand. "What I saw during that time made me leave politics altogether. We weren't just collecting student data for verification. We were categorizing them, building behavioral profiles, sorting students by how convertible they were to specific ideological messaging. We had code names for them, tiers. We were told to curate content for each type, not education, influence." Gas broke through the air like cracks in ice. Kirk shook his head, harder this time, lips moving silently as if denying each syllable before it landed. But he didn't interrupt. He didn't dare. Eric continued. "I believed in what we were doing. I thought we were helping kids like me, working class, uncertain, looking for a path. But the deeper I got, the more I saw how we were exploiting that uncertainty. We weren't offering education. We were selling access to minds that hadn't finished forming. And the buyer was always the same, political power." He stopped, not because he ran out of words, but because he didn't need more. The room held its breath. Jasmine stepped forward again, gently placing a hand on Eric's shoulder before he returned to his seat. She turned to the audience. "So when I say this isn't about Charlie Kirk mismanaging a scholarship," she said, voice now low and sharp as glass, "I mean it's about engineering consent through manipulation. It's about turning hope into a data point. It's about harvesting belief for profit." Kirk finally spoke, his voice brittle. I never authorized that kind of data collection. That's a mischaracterization. Jasmine didn't look at him. And yet, she said, turning to the crowd, your name was on the check, your face on the brochure, and your silence in every inbox that never got an answer. The audience was no longer whispering. They were murmuring, audibly, intensely. Some looked stunned, others betrayed. Phones were out, not for photos now, but for Google searches, screenshots, side conversations. The tide was turning, and Charlie Kirk knew it. He leaned toward his mic again, trying to pivot, trying to reclaim narrative. We're talking about a limited program, out-of-context data, one disgruntled former employee. But the words fell flat, because in that moment, what Jasmine had offered wasn't just evidence. It was confirmation. It was the naming of a pattern people had suspected, but never heard spelled out in full view, on live television, with no spin, no break, and no apology. She stepped back from the mic, once again without flourish, and this time, the silence wasn't empty. It was full of realization, of consequence, of a truth that had been sitting in plain sight all along, and now there was no one hearing it. The fallout from Eric's testimony still hung in the air, thick as fog. Viewers weren't just watching now. They were riveted, leaning in with that taut, edge-of-your-seat tension that usually belongs to courtroom dramas, not political panels. The moderator, visibly rattled, his cue cards trembling slightly in his hand, took a breath and tried to reassert control. "All right," he said, clearing his throat. "In the spirit of fairness and clarity, I'm going to ask each of you to respond. 60 seconds each. Mr. Kirk, you first." Charlie Kirk nodded slowly, trying to summon the polished rhythm that had carried him through hundreds of speaking engagements. But his voice, when it came, was just slightly off-tempo. Too fast, too defensive. "Listen," he began, managing a dry laugh that didn't land. "This is a lot of accusations thrown in rapid-fire succession." He raised a hand slightly as if appealing to reason. "I've spent the last 10 years fighting for young people across this country. I've spoken on over 1,000 campuses. And yes, we've built networks. We've raised money. Some of it's gone to administration, as every nonprofit does. But these claims that we're using data, manipulating minds, that's conspiratorial nonsense." He leaned forward, palms open. "Look, back in 2018, I partnered with organizations on both sides of the aisle. We held civil discourse forums. We brought people together. You can dig into anything and make it look ugly if that's what you're trying to do. But I'm not here to defend isolated details. I'm here because I believe in the cause, in American values, and I won't apologize for standing for them." The timer beeped faintly. The audience didn't clap, not even from his side. Jasmine Crockett adjusted her mic slowly, her hands deliberate. She didn't look triumphant. She looked focused, controlled. "I'm not going to use my 60 seconds to repeat what's already been said," she began, "but I will use it to clarify what's being hidden." She picked up a printed email and held it toward the moderator, then toward the camera. "This is from a senior political advisor, Brent Holzer, who was contracted by Mr. Kirk's organization in early 2023. She paused. This email, dated May 9th, was sent less than 48 hours after a national article criticized the scholarship program for its lack of transparency. She flipped the page so the audience could read the subject line on the screen behind her. "Narrative shift strategy, deploy ASAP." Her voice was calm, surgical. In this email, Holzer outlines a multi-phase plan to reposition the controversy as a smear campaign. Those are his exact words. He includes bullet points for social media talking points, campus ambassador briefings, and a list of influencers willing to post pre-scripted defense content in exchange for appearance fees. She didn't glance at Kirk. "One of those influencers, by the way, is a regular panelist on your live stream Q&A series, Mr. Kirk. The same live stream that ran ads for a merch line during a segment on cancel culture." A wave of sound moved through the crowd, not outrage, not shock, but that visceral noise of disillusionment solidifying into anger. Kirk opened his mouth, but the moderator raised a hand. "There will be time to respond," he said, voice tighter now. But first, we'll take a question from the audience. A spotlight turned, landing on a woman in her 30s near the back row. She held the mic steady, her voice crisp. Mr. Kirk, you've built your brand on words like integrity, faith, patriotism. But if what we're hearing is true, if this was a system built to manipulate belief, then I have one question. Are you selling trust to buy influence? The room froze. Kirk hesitated. He blinked. Twice. Then adjusted his tie. Slow, almost rehearsed. I think that's a gross oversimplification, he said finally. I've never profited personally from any of these programs. My team... He stopped. Wrong sentence. He shifted again. There are complexities in every large-scale operation. We live in a polarized time. People interpret intentions through their own lenses. What you call strategy, I call outreach. But it didn't land. His words felt limp, like they were dodging the target by inches. Then came the sound. Not a cheer, not a shout. A single sharp exhale. From Jasmine Crockett. A laugh, barely audible, but unmistakable. Not mocking, not loud, just real, tired, knowing. It cut through the room with the precision of someone who had heard this script before. Too many times from too many podiums, in too many rooms where people like her were asked to stay polite while being fed lies dressed as nuance. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to, because silence, when delivered with clarity, can land louder than any retort. And right then, everyone in that room understood who was answering the questions and who was avoiding them. The room hadn't even cooled from the last exchange before the next strike landed, but this time, it didn't come from the stage. It started during the commercial break. Staffers in headsets hustled, the moderator rehydrated behind the curtain, and the camera crew reset lenses. On the screens in the control booth, a clip began circulating. A video of Jasmine Crockett, 15 seconds long, cut mid-sentence and taken out of context. In it, she appears to say something inflammatory about the Constitution, except her tone is distorted, her pacing clipped, her point surgically removed. The chyron reads, Crockett calls Constitution obsolete. It was a lie, but it was engineered to go viral. By the time the program returned from break, the damage had begun. Phones in the audience glowed with headlines from fringe blogs and anonymous X accounts. The hashtag Crockett Hates America tag began trending nationally. Even some of the more moderate audience members were suddenly looking at Jasmine with hesitation. The cut had worked, fast and brutal, and the timing wasn't random. It was war. Jasmine returned to her seat slowly, aware of the energy shift. Her staffer leaned in and whispered something into her ear, showing her the tweet. She didn't blink. She didn't react. But the fire behind her eyes had changed temperature. She had been ambushed. Again. Not with truth, but with distortion. She had spent her entire career being told she was too much, too sharp, too direct, too unapologetically black, and now they'd tried to reduce her to a soundbite. The moderator returned to his podium, voice slightly rushed. We're now entering our final segment, one last chance for each speaker to address the audience. Congresswoman Crockett, your 90 seconds begin now. Jasmine stepped forward with the slow, deliberate pace of someone walking through flames barefoot, not in retreat but in ritual. She adjusted the mic, but this time, she didn't speak immediately. She let the silence stretch just long enough to reclaim the moment. And then calmly, while we were on break, some of you might have seen a video of me going around online. Murmurs rippled across the room. A few glances exchanged, some brows furrowed. I've seen it too, she continued. It's edited, it's dishonest, and it's familiar. Her tone was even, but something in the way she said familiar made the air tighten. Because when people like me speak truth, when we point to corruption with proof, not slogans, they don't respond with facts. They respond with fiction, with tricks, with digital sleight of hand. She looked straight into the camera, not blinking. They twist words and cut context, not to reveal who I am, but to protect who they are. She pulled out a printed frame of the video tweet and held it up to the audience. This is the tactic. This is the playbook. Frame the critic before the critique lands. Attack the messenger before the message spreads. Her voice sharpened. But ask yourself, if I'm wrong, why do they have to lie? If I'm so off base, why invent something new to discredit me? She took a step forward. Why do they spend millions creating noise instead of answering my questions with clarity? The room was frozen again, not because they didn't know what to feel, but because they knew exactly what she meant. I've been called radical, angry, divisive, she said. I've been told to smile more while being shouted over. I've had doors closed in my face, only to be asked later why I didn't knock harder. Her voice didn't crack, but it deepened, and every syllable landed like a stone. And now I'm being edited into a villain in real time, on your screens in front of your eyes. She paused, the silence pulsing now. But you know what that means? She asked. It means the truth scared them. It means the truth hit too close. And instead of disproving it, they're trying to drown it. Someone in the audience muttered, "Damn." Another murmured, "She's not wrong." Jasmine took one last look around. So here's my offer to you. Don't believe me because I'm on a stage. Believe me because I brought receipts. Because I asked questions they refused to answer. Because I didn't shout over them. I showed them. And because I stood still while they scrambled. The moderator looked stunned. He glanced at the clock, then at the stage director, then back at her. Time was up, but nobody wanted to cut her off. And then with a smile, not bitter, not triumphant, just firm, Jasmine leaned in one last time. They can cut clips, but they can't cut the truth. The lights dimmed a hair, and the studio, once again, held its breath. Charlie Kirk looked down, lips pressed, the footage still playing in silent loops across feeds outside the building. But inside that room, no one cared about the edit anymore. Because Jasmine Crockett had just taken back the frame, and she hadn't shouted. She'd outlasted. And in that moment, every smear, every headline, every attempt to rewrite her, dissolved in the sound of a woman who refused to be erased. The hall was still recovering from the last blow. Jasmine had just reclaimed her narrative from the viral smear, not with fury, but with control so exacting that it left the crowd silent, not stunned, but sobered. The moderator was about to speak when a voice broke through, not from the stage, but the floor. "Excuse me," said a young man rising from the middle row. He couldn't have been older than 22. Slender frame, pale knuckles gripping the microphone like a confession. His jacket was 2 sizes too big, his voice too sincere to be performative. There was a Turning Point USA pin still fastened to his lapel. The room turned toward him slowly. There was no security move, no interruption, just attention. "My name's Daniel. I go to a small college in Ohio. I was president of our TPUSA chapter last year," he began, eyes flickering toward the stage. "I organized events. I quoted Mr. Kirk's books in debates. I even defended him when people said the scholarship fund was shady. Because I believed, I really did." His voice didn't crack, but something in it broke anyway. "But after what I heard tonight, the documents, the targeting, the profiles, I don't know where I stand anymore. I don't know if I was part of something honest or part of something that used people like me to sell a brand." No one said a word. He looked directly at Jasmine now. "So my question isn't about who won this debate. My question is for you, Congresswoman. If you win, if everything you said is true, what do you do with it? What happens next?" A few heads turned toward her, but Jasmine was already looking at him, fully, as if no one else in the room existed for a moment, but the boy asking her not for policy, but for purpose. She stepped forward slowly, not dramatically, but with the weight of someone who's walked through too many rooms like this. Someone who's had to answer questions like that while knowing the real ones would never be asked on camera. She took a breath, not to gather herself, but to honor the gravity of what had just been given to her. "I appreciate your honesty, Daniel," she said, "and I want to answer you, not as a politician, but as someone who's been lied to her whole life about what this country values." Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "I didn't come here tonight to win a debate," she said. "I came here to make sure we don't lose something far more important, a future worth believing in." The line didn't trigger applause. Not yet. It was too heavy for that. Too real. "I know what it feels like to be handed a script and told it's a calling," she continued. To be given a t-shirt and told it's a movement. To be praised when you fall in line and erased the second you ask why the line exists in the first place. She paced slowly, her voice tightening, not with anger but with precision. I know what it feels like to want to believe in something so badly that you ignore the discomfort in your gut, that you defend people who wouldn't defend you, that you confuse access for acceptance, power for purpose, visibility for value. Now the room was still again, not cold, listening. You asked what I'll do next, she said. I'll go back to Congress, and I'll file for full oversight of nonprofit political data operations. I'll work to mandate transparency for scholarship foundations, who funds them, who gets the money, and who doesn't. I'll fight for digital privacy legislation, because no 17-year-old applying for help should be turned into a voter profile behind their back. She leaned closer to the mic, her voice like steel wrapped in velvet. But beyond that, she said, I'll keep showing up. I'll keep standing in rooms where I'm not expected to speak, but where silence would cost too much. I'll keep telling young people the truth, that their value is not determined by whether or not they echo someone else's slogan. That integrity doesn't trend, but it endures, and that the first betrayal they experience should not come from the person who offered them a scholarship. She paused, her voice softened, but never weakened. And I'll keep doing that, she said, because the war we're in isn't about left or right. It's about truth versus performance, conviction versus clickbait, leadership versus manipulation, and I refuse to let the next generation inherit a lie just because it was branded well. The moment landed. For a second there was nothing, and then someone, softly but clearly, began to clap. Then another, and then the entire room stood. Not like a crowd, like witnesses. And Daniel, still holding the mic in both hands, sat back down. Not with a victory, not with resolution, but with something heavier. Truth. And maybe for the first time, a kind he didn't want to look away from. The applause that had crowned Jasmine Crockett's last answer had only just begun to settle into the rafters when Charlie Kirk lunged for his microphone with the raw alarm of a man yanking a steering wheel on black ice, spitfiring claims that the moderator was a paid left-wing hall monitor, that the control room was cropping patriots out of frame, and that coastal elite producers were piping socialist talking points into Crockett's ear. The tirade, delivered in a single heaving breath, careened so wildly that the ticker beneath the stage glitched mid-scroll, and two junior technicians exchanged an unspoken "oh my God" glance. Realizing they had never watched a public figure torch his own narrative this completely, this live, beneath studio lights that suddenly felt more like interrogation lamps than flattering luminaires. The moderator, palms still trembling from earlier crossfire, yet voice as cool as a surgical steel scalpel, replied with forensic calm, reminding Kirk that the network had left his mic wide open when he'd branded a sitting congresswoman trash, that every syllable had rolled across 1 million living rooms unbleeped, and that claims of censorship rang hollow from a man whose loudest insult had been granted primetime amplification. The rebuttal, precise as a sniper's round, detonated Kirk's grievance narrative mid-flight and prompted heads across the hall to swivel, the overhead boom mic even dipping an inch lower as if hungry to record the sound of an empire cracking. Almost on cue, a fissure opened in the crimson block of Kirk supporters. Two silver-haired donors sporting Gilded Eagle lapel pins exchanged tight smiles before slipping into the aisle. A row of college activists in matching navy blazers folded branded placards with the efficiency of waiters clearing a ruined banquet, and a family of 4 shepherded teenage sons toward the exit as though the fire alarm had tripped, each departure carving empty red seats into the once unbroken grin of Kirk's fan section. The vacuum of support so palpable it seemed to inhale the oxygen from the air around him. Inside the control booth, the director's voice barked, "Titan, 20% digital," and the studio camera obeyed, creeping into a merciless close-up that devoured every pore. Beads of sweat sliding across Kirk's temple like runaway mercury, pupils ricocheting toward offstage monitors that now reflected nothing but his own unraveling, an index finger, only minutes earlier a maestro's baton, tapping Morse code tremors on the podium edge, subtle yet damning, Each staccato tap a subconscious admission that the narrative wheels were spinning against slick ice and his tires had lost traction. Attempting to claw back altitude, he launched into a frantic greatest hits medley: Hunter Biden's laptop, gender ideology in kindergarten, runaway gas prices under progressives, Black Lives Matter Marxism, but each bullet point landed like a mismatched jigsaw piece from another puzzle. Applause lines now stripped of context and lifeless as a deflated parade balloon. The algorithm of his rhetoric sputtering under the weight of documents, whistleblower testimony, and the brutal stillness of an audience that had crossed the threshold from fandom to witness. Seizing the momentum, the moderator offered what looked like a lifeline, but felt more like a dare, declaring that the network's real-time fact-check team stood ready to display any proof Kirk could produce: bank ledgers, raw server exports, notarized affidavits, to rebut the scholarship laundering or voter profiling charges. The invitation glittered for 3 agonizing seconds like a golden gangplank to redemption before his silence collapsed it, and that dead air roared louder than any denial, because every viewer understood instinctively that a man with proof would sprint across shattered glass to wave it on the big screen. The panic that had been brewing in his bloodstream finally erupted into physiology. A crimson flush climbed his neck, dampened the starched collar of his white shirt. Breaths shallow and rapid enough that the mic captured a faint pneumatic hiss, and when he pivoted once more to blame algorithmic shadow banning of conservative voices, the words clashed head-on with the memory of his unfiltered slur mere minutes earlier, a contradiction so glaring social media timelines immediately populated with split-screen memes mocking the hypocrisy in real-time GIFs before he had finished the sentence. Energy in the hall inverted. Kirk's side, once a solid wall of chest-puff certainty, resembled a patchwork quilt of unease stitched together by sideways glances, while Crockett's side radiated the controlled stillness of spectators who recognize momentum when it tilts irrevocably, a hush so taut one could hear cable reels spinning backstage and the faint clink of a stagehand's carabiner as he clipped a safety line to a moving light. Cornered, Kirk jabbed a trembling finger at the moderator, charging him with granting Jasmine luxury rebuttal windows. But the host calmly scrolled a digital stopwatch overlay, proving exact time parity, and ended the reprimand with an ice-cold fact. The only extended privilege tonight was yours when you used this platform to brand a colleague trash. A choice aired unedited, a line that sliced across the room like diamond wire, leaving Kirk's objections fluttering like torn flyers in a gust of cold air, and even the remaining loyalists shifted uncomfortably under its precision. As one last cluster of red-capped faithful slipped out, faces set in brittle smiles of passengers abandoning a sinking ship, Kirk's shoulders sagged, palms left damp smears on the polished podium, and the unforgiving camera stuck to him like a sentencing spotlight, transmitting in 4K every shudder of his jaw, every quiver of eyelid, every bead of sweat tracing defeat down his cheek, so that across the nation millions of screens witnessed a man, once master of media manipulation, drown in the very glare he'd fashioned into a weapon for so many years. Phones were still lighting up in the auditorium aisles when the wider internet ignited, and within 47 minutes of the broadcast feed cutting to credits, the twin hashtags, Trash or Truth and Jasmine Speaks, were pulsing through trending algorithms like twin arterial surges, with TikTok reaction cuts showing Crockett's single raised eyebrow racking up 2 million views before midnight, Twitter threads breaking down the scholarship shell game faster than professional auditors, Discord servers filling with frame-by-frame analyses of Charlie Kirk's sweat beads, and Reddit dashboards tracking the hashtag's climb from regional to national to global in real time. Each screenshot graph, a neon seismograph charting the cultural aftershock of a slur, turned inside out by receipts, dignity, and a sentence nobody in the control room had cued in the teleprompter. Cable news anchors still wiping makeup from their collars were forced back under studio lights for emergency panels, where analysts, some leaning eager, others stunned, agreed on virtually nothing except the scale of the blast radius, dubbing the showdown the TikTok Scopes trial and the first primetime crucible of Gen Z civic identity. arguing over whether Crockett's restraint or her evidence wounded Kirk more deeply, while scrolls beneath their chyrons updated in near real time. 28,000 college-age donors cancel Turning Point pledges. Arizona Senate schedules inquiry into nonprofit data harvest loopholes. Campus GOP chapter posts statement denouncing slur. Headlines that only fanned the trending flames higher as young viewers spliced clips of Jasmine's calm, deliberate pauses into lo-fi study loops titled Proof Beats Screaming That Itself trended on Spotify's Viral 50. In dorm lounges from Austin to Ann Arbor, watch party crowds that had begun the night betting on Kirk's meme master bravado now scrolled in slack-jawed silence through spreadsheets Jasmine released post-show. Zip files marked Evidence Pack 1, where line items for mentorship retreat cabana upgrade sat beside student outreach budget, $0, and the hush that settled was the sound of freshmen seeing a bright brand circuitry for the first time. Shards of idealism scattering like glass across tiled common room floors because the betrayal was intimate. It was their demographic, their inbox, their vulnerabilities that had been auctioned. On Instagram Reels, the phrase, "I came to make sure we don't lose a future," looped against a montage of civil rights marches and campus rallies, stitched by creators barely old enough to vote, yet savvy enough to know a generational thesis when they heard one. And in the comment lines beneath, teenagers who had once worn Kirk's eagle logo in profile pictures typed confessions of disillusionment. She didn't yell once, and I still felt every word. While parents who'd tuned in for a quick policy clash found themselves watching their children rewrite household political assumptions in real time. Dinner table authority dissolving under the glow of touchscreens. Meanwhile, memes of Kirk's wide-eyed freeze frame, captioned, "Connection lost at Truth Signal," spread from Twitter to WeChat, each repost another pebble in a digital landslide, and social listening dashboards inside corporate PACs flagged the sentiment swing so violently negative that 2 energy sector donors pulled scheduled ad buys within 12 hours, citing brand safety uncertainty, a euphemism analysts translated on morning shows as, "Nobody wants to bankroll a sinking flagship when the crew has abandoned deck, and the passengers are tweeting the iceberg's GPS coordinates." Pollsters at Next Gen Analytics, who had sampled youth sentiment since sunrise, published a midnight snap poll showing a 12-point trust swing toward progressive truth-tellers among voters aged 18 to 30, the largest single-night delta since Occupy Wall Street, and within minutes, Politico's push alert called it the Jasmine Spike, speculating that every 2026 campaign manager would now scramble to court her endorsement or, at the very least, bribe away her data forensics team before hearings turned subpoenas into handcuffs. Behind paywalled analyst notes, hedge fund research divisions flagged the moment as a market signal for social integrity equities, predicting ad tech stocks reliant on dark profile targeting would suffer first-quarter shocks once Congress weaponized Crockett's files. By sunrise, Crockett's office inbox overflowed with invitations, student government coalitions requesting campus tours, 2 late-night hosts offering prime sofas, a trio of Ivy League law journals vying to serial publish her policy blueprint, and a bipartisan block of House freshmen quietly inquiring how to replicate her data transparency bill in their own districts. Each email a proof of concept that a single night of disciplined facts could burn hotter and travel farther than 5 years of algorithm dog whistles, provided the messenger carried herself with the unflinching steadiness of someone who'd been told to sit down her whole life and decided to build a podium instead. Across conservative media, frantic spin cycles churned, panels alleging deepfake forgeries, columnists invoking digital lynch mobs, think tank fellows warning of youth captured by grievance socialism. Yet none of it gained altitude, because the receipts were already open source, and the insult had been televised unedited, every denial ricocheting off a wall of time-stamped reality, and so the discourse kept sliding toward a simpler binary, one captured in the competing hashtags themselves. Trash, or truth, wasn't just trending, it was forcing a moral multiple-choice exam into every feed, requiring users to pick a side or admit their apathy in silence, a social media Schrodinger's box that collapsed only when clicked. Late-night pundits attempted wry summary, calling it the debate that defenestrated dog whistles, while historians on C-SPAN After Hours invoked the 1960 Kennedy-Nixon broadcast, but insisted this was more radical. Nixon sweated. Kirk imploded in a meme economy, one guest remarked, adding that the real shift wasn't camera complexion, but audience agency. Young viewers didn't just watch a moment, they weaponized it, distilling Crockett's restraint into shareable mantras and Kirk's meltdown into cautionary gift parables. A participatory alchemy that turned spectators into manufacturers of narrative, forging not simply votes but viral antibodies against future demagogues. By the time morning commute shows rolled their theme music, the phrase generation-defining debate had ossified into panel consensus, quoted by centrists and radicals alike. And somewhere, between the satellite link-ups and the op-ed deadlines, Jasmine Crockett wrote a pre-dawn flight back to Washington, eyes rimmed red from scanning new evidence uploads on her laptop, knowing the true battle, the committee hearings, the subpoenas, the red line drafts, still lay ahead. Yet feeling for the first time in a decade of uphill fights, that the wind of a newly awakened youth might finally be at her back rather than in her face. A tailwind birthed from one night, 2 hashtags, and an unedited insult that shattered under the weight of verifiable truth. Momentum, once loosed from the studio spotlights, roared through boardrooms and campus commons alike. And by Tuesday dawn, a chain reaction of risk assessment memos was thudding onto executive desks. The largest of Charlie Kirk's corporate benefactors, a Midwest financial tech giant that had quietly poured 7 figures into his scholarship branding in exchange for bespoke voter micro-targeting, held an emergency video call in which compliance lawyers replayed his trash slur alongside Jasmine Crockett's receipts, then overlaid real-time Twitter sentiment graphs that looked less like a dip and more like a cliff face, prompting the CEO, cheeks splotched crimson, to mutter the fiduciary mantra, brand safety, before instructing counsel to invoke a reputation breach clause and sever the relationship that very hour. A typed termination notice speedy signed and fired off with the corporate equivalent of a firing squad. Concise, lethal, irrevocable. Word of the rupture reached Kirk's inner circle while they were still drafting a defiant Substack post. He took the call in a glass conference room whose tinted walls suddenly felt aquarium transparent, listening as the sponsor's liaison deployed antiseptic phrases. Untenable optics, irreversible dilution of goodwill, unacceptable stewardship, each one landing like a calibrated body blow that drained his face of color and his posture of swagger, until the only sound in the room was his pen tapping in a rhythmic stutter against a legal pad where talking points had moments before seemed bulletproof. The pad now blank except for the imprinted outline of his own trembling handwriting. In frantic triage, his PR chief suggested pivoting to a martyr narrative, but data consultants showed dashboards where even sympathetic demographics were sliding into negative net favorability, and suggestion turned to open dread when a second sponsor, a firearms accessories brand heavily invested in youth outreach, paused payment on an upcoming campus tour, rationalizing in a curt email that the audience we've cultivated values composure, a phrase so diplomatically venomous it made clear Kirk's brand of brashness had crossed from edgy to outright radioactive, leaving him to stare at a balance sheet bleeding red in real time, his sense of control dissolving in sync with each incoming cancellation ping. While Kirk's empire leaked capital, Jasmine Crockett's phone vibrated like a live wire. The first call came from Georgetown's Center for Politics, a program once hesitant to book freshman firebrands, but now eager to headline her as a case study in evidence-driven advocacy, offering a keynote slot, travel honorarium, and a breakout session on digital ethics, all confirmed in a 6-minute conversation that ended with the director confessing his own students had demanded her presence by #vote. The democratic inversion of traditional lecture circuit gatekeeping. 90 minutes later, as she reviewed the forwarded termination notice from Kirk's former backer, a document she filed not with glee but with the sober satisfaction of accountability, her scheduler flashed 2 more invitations. Ohio State's John Glenn College, which framed its pitch as an urgent dialogue on political transparency, and the University of Texas at Austin, whose student government had unanimously passed a resolution titled Truth Over Trends that formally requested Crockett's appearance. Both schools, in separate time zones and ideological climates, offered stages within 48 hours of each other, covering travel costs up front and promising overflow rooms for what they predicted would be record attendance. Each acceptance email read like a small vindication, yet Crockett felt the weight of every line. She replayed the insults, the doctored clip, the years of hearings where she'd been interrupted mid-sentence, and understood that these invitations were not laurels but responsibilities, chances to convert a viral moment into sustained civic muscle, to remind students that truth requires boring tasks, faux IA requests, statutory language, budget subclauses, far beyond the flash of a trending hashtag. And so she drafted replies that accepted the podiums but insisted on workshops afterward, small group sessions where she would walk aspiring organizers through the mechanics of legislation, the way other speakers break down box scores or start up pitch decks. News of her rapid-fire campus tour leaked to the press by Wednesday afternoon. Cable pundits who on Monday had questioned her polish were now dubbing her the policy whisperer for Gen Z, while Kirk's defenders on fringe podcasts sputtered that universities had become shrines to socialist celebrity. Yet their outrage found little oxygen because the mainstream narrative had coalesced around an image too potent to counterspin. An unflappable congresswoman answering smear with substance and being rewarded not with a viral pat on the back, but with direct, tangible demand for her voice, creating a supply and demand curve where integrity, for once, was the commodity in shortest supply. Back inside Turning Point headquarters, Kirk's conference room thrummed with the low-grade panic of brand managers drafting salvage blueprints none of them fully believed. Screens displayed heat maps of campus chatter, where red once glowed like embers but now flickered anemic yellow. Each pixel a real-time reminder that passion follows credibility, the way iron filings chase a magnet, and credibility once shattered reassembles only at geological pace. Not on the timeline of quarterly fundraising cycles, a reality hitting Kirk harder than any debate stage ambush. By Thursday dusk, Jasmine sat in a quiet corner of Reagan National, a carry-on at her feet and 3 speech drafts open on her laptop, watching the terminal CNN feed announce Kirk's lost sponsorship as a Chiron, major donor withdrawals from conservative youth group amid controversy, and she felt no jubilation, only the austere certainty that systemic accountability is less climax than doorway, because every dethroned demagogue leaves followers searching for a new voice, and every exposed scheme drifts toward the next loophole unless watched by citizens with the vigilance of sleepless centuries. So as her boarding group was called, she closed the laptop, inhaled the recycled airport air heavy with the scent of burnt coffee and jet fuel, and reminded herself that the true victory wasn't the lost money on Kirk's ledger or the spike in her social metrics. It was the murmured conversation she'd overheard 2 gates down, where a pair of students debated subpoena procedures using her floor speech as reference, proof that in 48 hours the currency of spectacle had been partially exchanged for the slower, sturdier goal to process, and that, she decided, was a future worth not losing. And that quiet airport realization, small as it seemed against the roar of hashtags and canceled checks, became the hinge on which the entire narrative swung. The moment when people scrolling feeds at midnight felt something heavier than partisan thrill crack open inside them. And it is from that hinge the story pivots now, away from scoreboard victory and towards something slower, stranger, and more permanent. The next morning, instead of sharing victory memes, thousands of young viewers opened PDFs, highlighting budget line items and Googling nonprofit tax codes, their dorm room conversations shifting from, "Did you see her own hymn?" to "How do we audit local boards?" While group chats that once traded slogan graphics began circulating templates for FOIA requests. A groundswell of procedural curiosity that startled even veteran organizers who had spent years begging people to read meeting minutes. In that hush between viral thrill and civic hunger, you could almost hear the gears of latent power unlocking. Each click a kid realizing outrage alone is a treadmill if it never feeds muscle. Cable anchors expecting a victory lap found themselves interviewing 20-year-olds quoting appropriation subclauses, and pundits who had sharpened talking points for culture war fireworks had to swallow them When callers asked not about tribal loyalty, but about the legal definitions of 501c3 violations, the studio lights suddenly illuminating faces unprepared for a conversation that required substance instead of sentiment, revealing how thin their analysis sounded once the room demanded receipts rather than recrimination. On campuses, professors of constitutional law reported record walk-ins during office hours, students clutching printouts of Crockett's evidence packs and asking whether data harvest loopholes could be closed by state statute or required federal oversight. The kind of granular inquiry that rarely accompanies internet sensations, but now bubbled like a newly tapped spring. And that shift from meme to mechanism spread faster than any smear clip because it carried the oxygen of self-discovery. People tasting the difference between performance politics and participatory governance for the first time. In church basements and union halls, organizers who had weathered decades of apathy watched fresh volunteers arrive not with chants, but with spreadsheets. And the veterans, long accustomed to fighting indignities with skeleton crews, felt a cautious thrill, a sense that the cavalry might finally be coming, though it marched on laptops rather than horses, armed with curiosity instead of slogans. A generational reinforcement summoned not by charisma alone, but by the unassailable gravitational pull of documented truth. Even among Kirk's remaining supporters, the tone shifted from chest-thumping memes to bruised introspection, Discord channels filling with posts that read less like battle cries and more like diary entries, confessions of feeling played, questions about why a movement that promised transparency hid its budgets behind shell LLCs, and whether being conservative required loyalty to a man or loyalty to verifiable fact. An identity crisis unfolding in real time as ideological armor cracked under the weight of contradictory receipts. In Washington, lobbyists who once counted on youth disengagement to grease status quo gears began booking consultants in digital integrity, and staffers who had ignored Crockett's early committee motions quietly revisited them, sensing that cameras might soon turn on any vote that gutted accountability. Their polished hallways thrummed with a new, unsettling possibility that procedure itself could become primetime content. The dry amendments could trend if a generation decided tedium was a small price for ownership of its future. Through it all, Jasmine Crockett moved like a relay runner who refuses to break stride for applause, boarding flights, annotating drafts, and reminding every eager interviewer that her goal was never an individual takedown, but a systemic reckoning, that truth is a muscle strained into strength only by repetition, and that a single debate means nothing if the viral energy dissipates before policy calcifies. A warning spoken softly but ringing louder than any victory speech because it framed the stakes not as a personal feud, but as a public inheritance. And so the story's crescendo arrives without confetti. No final punch-out, no victory pose silhouette, only the image of millions of phones dimming as users put them down to open city council agendas, of sponsors rewriting grant clauses to require independent audits, of former partisans sitting across diner tables debating statutes instead of stereotypes. A culture shifting from the adrenaline of hurling words to the disciplined breathing of listening and building. Proof that sometimes the most cinematic ending is no ending at all, just a collective intake of breath before the long, necessary labor of staying awake. And if the story's climax was a collective breath before action, then its coda, the human lesson carved beneath every headline, arrives like a pulse you feel only after the adrenaline drains, reminding us why the fight mattered in the first place. Because Jasmine Crockett's ordeal teaches that injustice is rarely a single, cinematic explosion. It is a slow drip corrosion, the everyday grinding of power against the unprotected, and the true heroism is not a knockout blow, but the stamina to stay standing when that grind feels endless. It shows that dignity can survive open insults, doctored videos, and weaponized doubt if it is fused to verifiable truth, and that the most dangerous person in any corrupt system is the one who will not trade their silence for comfort. It reveals that crowds can be seduced by spectacle, yet still pivot towards substance the moment someone dares to put receipts on the table and trust them to read. It proves that courage is contagious. One measured voice can pull a room from chanting to thinking, and thinking, once ignited, spreads faster than any meme because it feeds on questions instead of outrage. It warns that cynicism is the cheapest armor the powerful can hand the powerless, convincing them nothing changes, while hope, sharpened by evidence, is the blade that slices through that lie. It reminds every bystander that neutrality is a choice that sides with inertia, and that silence in the face of documented harm is not peacekeeping but permission. It demonstrates that victory is not the sponsor lost or the podium gained, but the moment a young believer asks tougher questions of the people he once cheered, and the system trembles because curiosity has replaced cheerleading. Finally, it insists that the arc of justice is not a cosmic guarantee but a collective construction job, filed, stamped, audited, and defended by ordinary people who decide that facts are worth the tedium, that voices are worth the risk, and that a future they can trust is worth staying awake for, long after the cameras and hashtags move on. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.